Just here? It doesn't matter to me. As long as nobody throws tomatoes and eggs at me, I'm fine.
Yeah. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسوله النبي الكريم وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد اللهم بارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. So, as we've done in the past, what we've tried to start doing is moving away from giving pure lectures for the, within these events, and actually try to make it into a bit more of an interactive type of a environment. So, with our guest today, inshallah, we have Dr. Parvez Ahmad, and he has a very long bio, but I just wanted to give you a breakdown of it, because I think if I start reading the bio, it'll become longer than his talk. But just to give you all a background, he has a BS in Mechanical Engineering from Aligarh Muslim University in India. He then did his MBA from Temple University in Philadelphia, and then his PhD in Finance at the University of Texas in Arlington. Right now, he is a professor at the University of Northern Florida. And he's been quite involved with the Muslim community. He's been involved with CARE. And we are blessed today to have him here with us. And I don't really want to go too much into, all the background, because he can, inshallah, tell you what some of the work that he is doing and how we can, inshallah, help him in that regard. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to him.
Yeah. Jazakallah khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wa salatu wa salam ala Rasulil Kareem. Can you hear me? Okay. So I do not want to make the talk long. I know the night is already late, and just want to make a few observations. And I want to make these observations in the context of some of the news of the time. So if you look at the Quran, one of the most enduring themes in the Quran is the concept of taqwa. Right? It is a recurring theme in the Quran. The word taqwa, or in its derivative form, ittaqu, tattaqu, in its various forms, it appears at least 166 times in the Quran. So it's a very central idea within our faith. Because taqwa is not just an attitude, it's a process. We do not arrive and then we are static there. It's a process. We have to be continually pushing ourselves to remain in the state of taqwa, to remain in the state of God consciousness. By the way, the word taqwa is almost impossible to translate into English. I have not yet found one word, one English word that properly captures the essence of the word taqwa. Some people say, in different translations, sometimes I've read it as a fear of God, which I don't think so is the right interpretation of that word. I think the word that is probably closest would be a consciousness of God. But even then, it does not do full justice to it. So when a person orients their hearts towards this God consciousness that we call taqwa, then there are three elements to it. There's an element of love, there is an element of devotion, and there's an element of fear. But I'll talk about fear a little bit differently. It is an element of love because the source of this God consciousness has to come from a place of love. And we don't talk enough about love, particularly in the context of love towards God. Like when people read poetries of Sufi poetries, Rumi or others, they often think that Rumi wrote about human love. But all of the references to the beloved in his poetry is a reference to the divine. These are poetries of divine love. And from this love then flows devotion. Because you can't be devoted to a person if you don't love that person. You can't be devoted to God if you don't love God. And then from that comes an element of fear, or the more appropriate word would be bashfulness. In a fear in a sense that I am so bashful because of all the bounties God has given me, that I'm afraid to transgress or do anything that would destabilize my loving relationship with my Creator. One of my favorite stories from the history of Islam is actually a story that is very seldom told, and even when it is told, I'm not sure it is properly understood. It's the story of a famous personality. Her name was Rabia al-Basri. Some of you may know the story. She was found one time walking in the streets with a bucket of water in one hand and a mashal, a torch, in another hand. So people asked her, like, why? Why are you walking like this? And she said, with this torch, I want to set heaven on fire. And with the bucket of water, I want to extinguish the fire of hell. And people said, that seems like the opposite, right? She's like, what are you talking about? And she said, the reason I want to do this is because people should not love God because of an expectation of reward or punishment. We should love God simply because He is God. He is the Creator. Because we are so thankful of His creation, so thankful that He has given us the opportunity to be in His service, that should be sufficient. Not because of material reward or even an otherworldly reward. There is a lot of depth to what she is talking about, but it is a state that is hard to attain, but it is something certainly that we can strive for. In other words, our relationship to God should not be, I am doing my salah because I will pass the exam. That should not be our relationship. It's not a transactional relationship, that if I do this, then God will give me that. It may happen, it may not happen. And it is beyond our capacity to comprehend what bounties we have and when the reward of God that we perceive as a bounty is a bounty or when it is a curse. Something may look good, but maybe it's not good for us. And this idea, has been in my mind recently, particularly after the incidents in New Zealand. And the reason is because related to the concept of taqwa is the idea of justice. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if you look at the concept of justice in Islam in Surah Nisa, ayah 135, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "O you who have believed, be persistent in standing firm for justice as a witness to God." Now that first part of the ayah could be found in any religious text or any philosophical text. If you believe in God, stand up for justice. That's an easy thing to say. Hard thing to practice, but easy thing to say. The next part of the ayah is the most challenging part of the ayah. That says that even if it is against yourself, stand up for justice even when you are inconvenienced by it, or your parents are inconvenienced by it, or your community is inconvenienced by it. So stand on the path of truth and justice even when it is difficult for you to do it. Now that to me is a very remarkable thing to say. It's a very exalted standard. It is almost an impossible standard for human beings to meet. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks us to strive on that path. That's the trajectory for us as individuals as well as a community to move in that direction of justice. Why did New Zealand prompt me to think about it? Because of course what happened in New Zealand was an act of profound injustice. Right? And we are all outraged by it. We are afraid, we are fearful, we are concerned, we are sad. Partly because any one of us who have come to a masjid, when you read the bios of the 50 martyrs, they all look like people like us. I read the bio of one person and say, I met somebody in the masjid who has that same bio, or who looks like this person. So at a personal level, we could relate to all of them, even though they are thousands of miles away from us. And it evokes a certain emotion and a certain sentiment within us. And that's natural. But to me, if we as a Muslim community agitate about New Zealand, or about Islamophobia that is at the heart of what happened in New Zealand, standing up against Islamophobia, to me, is not an act of justice. It's an act of self-interest. Naturally, because Islamophobia is going to negatively affect all of us, affect our children, so I want to stand up against it and fight against it. The act of justice is what the Prime Minister of New Zealand did, because she went way out of her way overboard to make the Muslim community feel as at home, to heal the situation. She went beyond our call to duty. That's an act of justice. She did not have to do it. She could have done the bare minimum as most political leaders do. No offense to you, sir. But she went beyond the call of duty. She stood up for a community that she was not part of. And she stood up for that community by making that community feel that it is part of her. So my question to you is that this is not the first time a house of worship has been attacked. We saw this in Pittsburgh when a Jewish synagogue was attacked. We saw this in Wisconsin when a Sikh temple was attacked. We saw this in South Carolina when a black church was attacked. Did each one of us feel the same fear, the same anxiety, the same sense of standing with those communities as we want others to stand with us today? And if the answer is no, then we are not practicing justice the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala asks us to do it. That is standing up for justice when you feel that somebody else's problem is your problem. And to get to that point, it is not an easy thing to do because human beings by nature are motivated by self-interest. How do we get to that point where we feel for the pain of others the same way we feel for the pain of ours? And to get to that point, we have to practice one thing. And to me, this is not a message for Muslims. This is a message for humanity. What we have to practice is to not think of the other as the other. If we want others to stop thinking of us as the other, we have to stop thinking of them as the other. So two things. First of all, don't otherize yourself. Don't take yourself out of the society. Seclude yourself. Put barriers around your community so that you stand apart in a way that it is easy for somebody to otherize you. Make you look exotic, make you look something that, these people are not really of us. And that makes us vulnerable. But at the same time, we have to also reciprocate on the other side, where we don't treat other communities like they are the other. When they are in pain, that we show up. When the synagogue was attacked and your local synagogue organized a vigil, I hope all of you showed up. And this is not the last time we will have a tragedy of this magnitude. Unfortunately, such tragedies have become way too common. And we show up for that. Not only because it's an act of self-interest, because that's the way we orient ourselves. Too often, we in the Muslim community, we think of the ummah as the Muslim ummah. But the word ummah in the Quran is used way beyond the Muslim community. It does reflect the Muslim community, but it is also addressed as a word of others, like the ummah of humanity, and including even the ummah of the creation. So when we think about our people, who are we thinking about? Are those people our people who worship like us, who eat like us, who dress like us, who talk like us? Or are our people our neighbors who worship differently, who think differently, may have a different point of view about politics, but we still consider them as our people and treat them with the same compassion as I will treat my own family members? When we think about the life of the Prophet ﷺ, and this will be my final point, and then I'll open it up for conversation as our dear Imam has suggested we do. This entirety of what I'm trying to say can be summarized with one simple statement from our beloved Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The best among you is one who is best towards all people. He did not say all Muslims. He did not say all people in your community. He said all people, all the time. Not only when there's a tragedy befalling us or when there's a danger coming towards us, but all the time. This becomes our part of our character. As the Prophet ﷺ is described as that you stand, O you Prophet, you stand on the most exalted of character, khuluqil adhim, on the most exalted of character. What does that exalted character mean? That his character was such that he is a shining example, not to Muslims, but to all of humanity. And we as people who profess love towards our beloved Prophet, then that has to be part of our character, part of our destiny, that we treat others like this. And I don't think so at this moment in time there is a more important message than this. At a time when humanity is fragmented by all kinds of narrowness, almost mind-numbing violence, and a type of hatred that defies reason and logic. Why would a Muslim walk into a gay bar and shoot up people? Why would somebody walk into a black church and shoot up worshipers? Why would somebody walk into a mosque and shoot up people? Why? You may or may not like what the church is preaching, or you may or may not like what the mosque is preaching. You may or may not like people who are LGBT. Does not mean you shoot them up. And the question becomes, why aren't we in solidarity with people who are feeling these kinds of challenges? Again, if we do, there are two ways to do it. One way is to do it because it's in our self-interest. Even if we do that, that's okay to me. But to me, that goes back to Rabia's statement. Don't seek God because you're trying to do transaction with God. Seek the love of God because that's the right thing to do. Period. End of story. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر المسلمين من كل ذنب فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. Let's have a conversation.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Pervez. First and foremost, thank you for joining us tonight. There was something that I actually wanted to reflect on. In the hundreds of khutbahs that I've given in 2-3 years, I think today was the first time where I went up there not knowing what to say. Because last week I didn't give the khutbah when this incident happened in New Zealand. But today when I went up there, I'm just like, I don't know what I could potentially prepare as in like a statement. Because, you know, sometimes when people hear statements, they know it's just written word. And I think one thing which really got to me today or yesterday was when I heard the Prime Minister of New Zealand, when she was actually, you know, at the vigil at the Jummah that they were holding, a part of me made me wonder that she's like more Muslim than many Muslims at the end of the day, in so many different ways, because it's exactly what you said. When someone else gets hurt, when someone else is on the receiving end of oppression, we see that a lot of times we have to make excuses to be there for that person. And it comes from a very harrowing perspective, because the Prophet ﷺ, that wasn't his character. And you don't have to like pull something out of like left field. When we look at his life, right, we knew that he used to treat non-Muslims in a manner that sometimes he wouldn't treat even his own Muslim brothers and sisters who, let's say, had done something bad. Like, for example, if there was a non-Muslim living under like Muslim protection or something, you know, back then when like there was Muslim statehood, like he said that the person who harms this non-Muslim is going to be in the hellfire. We see that he used to work with non-Muslims in a manner in which it would be at their level. So I guess my question to you is, when it comes to this sort of exceptionalism, and I think it's a two-pronged exceptionalism. On one end, there's this Islamic exceptionalism when it comes to living within society, wherein we think that everything ought to be catered to us because we are Muslim. We're dealing with that on one end. And I think with my generation, there's another aspect of it, which no one is talking about, but it's the elephant in the room, which is American exceptionalism. Like, I am American. I'm an American Muslim. I'm the best type of Muslim. So how would we go about kind of addressing it both ways?
So it's a very difficult challenge, because the way I approach this issue is, I think we as a Muslim community, and as even Muslim scholarship, imams who speak about these issues, too often we define Islam in very narrow terms. And we define Islam as a set of identity. We talk about our Islamic identity or our Muslim identity. And in talking about identity, we make it trivial. Do you have a beard? Do you wear a hijab? Is your thobe a certain length? You know? Do you say certain things? Do you say Alhamdulillah and all of these other words that kind of signal to others that you are in? Right? I'm not outside, I'm an insider. I can speak the language. But that misses the point. You know, saying Arabic does not make you Muslim. Saying, you don't have to say Alhamdulillah. Even if you say praise be to God, that's fine too. It means the same thing. You know, so if we boil everything down to identity markers, litmus tests, if you do this, you say this, you are inside. If you don't say the right word, or you don't say that, dress the right way, you are outsider. We completely cheapen Islam. And we turn Islam into a political movement. But that's a disservice. At the core, as I was mentioning about taqwa, one of the things in my khutbah today, at the other masjid, I mentioned this, that when you do taqwa right, the link of taqwa is linked to a set of values. What are they? Accountability, justice, kindness, mercy, love, equality, honesty, compassion, fairness. Now these are a set of values. They're not identity markers. They don't ask you that you have to do this, then you are my side. If you don't do this, you're on the other side. These are a set of values that we have to practice no matter who we are, no matter what stage of life we are, no matter what the circumstances. So when we talk about, let's say, justice as an idea, which is linked to taqwa, be just. So when you look at a situation like New Zealand, of course you want the perpetrator to be brought to justice. You know, if the country allows death penalty, you may want the death penalty on this person. I'm, by the way, personally against death penalty. I'll stipulate that up front. But let me leave aside my personal feelings aside. But putting this person to justice does not solve the problem. So when we think about justice, we sometimes think about it in a very narrow sense of a retributive justice. That we have taken revenge. Something, I was wronged and I've taken revenge on that wrong. But the Prophet ﷺ also practiced something called a restorative justice, where the process, where the issue is how to heal, how to bring about wholeness after something has been torn apart. That requires rising above. So what the Prime Minister of New Zealand was doing was she was practicing a form of restorative justice. She knows that as the leader of her country, something has been torn apart in her country. And just taking revenge is not enough. There has to be a mechanism of healing. And that's why she went above and beyond, not only visiting the masjid. Today, as you know, the call to prayer was broadcast nationally all across New Zealand. Life came to a halt for 2 minutes for people to honor. The entire country came to a stop to honor the victims. Why are these actions important? To evoke a sense of that these Muslims are part of my community. I am their leader. I am responsible for what happened. And I want to heal that community. It's a set of values. She's not practicing identity. She does not care about the identity. She is saying that I need to practice my values of love and compassion and mercy and approach justice in a way that heals the society. Now that's a very difficult standard. That's why across the world, people are praising her. Today there was a Washington Post editorial that said that we want our next president to be like her. We want our leaders to be like her. Now, that's the character. As you said, she is acting more Muslim than Muslims.
Yeah.
She is acting human. She's acting as humanity should be, as humanity ought to be. It is the exalted character that the Quran talks about. It is the exalted character that the Prophet ﷺ, just imagine, what would the Prophet ﷺ have done in this situation? He would have probably done the same thing she is doing.
Well, we've seen that, right?
Right.
With Fateh Makkah.
Right. Trying to heal the process, trying to bring people. So what we need to focus as community, as people, is to practice these values in a way that universalizes these values, not confine them within the four walls of a masjid. To join in solidarity with people who are also pushing these boundaries. Sometimes they may involve working in political movements, sometimes they may involve working in social movements, but also it means discussing those things inside the masjid. At what level do you discuss the issue of homelessness in your community or hunger in your community? These are universal problems in America. Or the idea of criminal justice in this country, which disproportionately victimizes people of color. Why is that not an issue for you? Because partly you think, I live a life of privilege. You're wealthy, you either come from wealthy families, or you're a physician, or a professor, or a IT professionals. You live in a gated community. You live a life of privilege, and you don't think about the other. But that's when you lose. That's when humanity loses. And at the end of the day, that is the state we want Muslims to be. That's the leadership role that Muslims, when they played that leadership role, they were the beloved community in this world. When we ceded that leadership role, people despise us.
One thing which I learned recently in one of my classes was that a professor, it's really interesting, he is a Columbia PhD, and his father, he's a Muslim, but his father converted to Islam after many years. But before, while he was a Christian, he used to attend Bible study in Atlanta with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And one thing that they were mentioning was that in any society that Islam took root, just about any society, at the end, what it came down to, especially in America, and like American Muslim movements, was that they came to address a certain social issue. And that's how Islam took root, and people forget this, right? It is that characteristic that you can talk about. For example, you look at Indonesia, you look at Malaysia, you look at these majorly Muslim societies in which social justice, as it was awarded on an equal front to everyone, is what led people to gravitate towards Islam as a solution, that led them to gravitate towards Islam as a means and as a solution to their justice. So it's just interesting that that point goes into.
Can I mention one point? You raised something very important. So if you look at, compare, I was talking about this with Dr. Saud Anwar on our drive over here. When you look at the status of women at the time of our beloved Prophet, and how he pushed the empowerment of women to its outer boundaries, pushed the limits on it, from his personal life to his communal life, through scripture and through practice, in both ways. So much so that after he passed away, the men in those communities, although he lived in a very patriarchal society, a men-dominated society, they would go to his wife, Aisha, to ask opinions. She was the leading scholar of her time, the leading opinion maker of her time. And when you fast forward today, 1400 years later, on every dimension of women empowerment, Muslim societies are at the very bottom, all across the world. How? How is a tradition that, through the practice of its founding personality, through scriptural perspective, pushed the empowerment of women to the limit, and a century or so later, the process reverses? And it continues to slide. The question that I often think about myself and I pose to others is, if the Prophet ﷺ were to come today, would he accept the status quo of the women in our Muslim communities? Or would he push the boundaries again? Will he rise up and again ask his community to rethink, why are we treating people like this? 50% of our community. Look at it, even in, I'm not trying to be critical, I do not know how your Islamic Center governs, so don't take this as a personal conversation. I'm just making a general observation. Very few women are on the boards of Islamic centers. Very few women are in leadership positions. We do not even allow women to come up and speak from the front of the masjid. You talked about Akram. Akram is the greatest scholarship that Akram is engaged in, which is the scholarship that Carla Power talks about in her book. All of you read that book, If the Oceans Were Ink. This is a story of an American journalist who befriended a Muslim scholar who comes from the same institution that your imam comes from, and she wrote a story about their friendship. And what Akram is involved in is compiling the history of Muslim women scholars. And when Akram started this project, he thought there will be a few dozen maybe he will write about. It is well over tens of thousands now. He's writing basically a compendium of their biography.
50 volumes.
50 volumes now, right? So there was a time when, compared to the rest of the world, Muslim women were at the cutting edge of rights and prestige in their society. Today, the picture is completely 180-degree opposite. The rest of the world has moved on, while the Muslim women have continually receded into the background. So these are conversations that we must have. It is not enough to have conversations about, the minute practices of Sunnah. I'm not trying to denigrate that. That has its place, and the finer points of fiqh has its time. But not at the exclusion of these other things. And that requires a critical reflection on our own part. From the way we talk to our daughters at home, to the way we deal with them in a communal setting. If your son asks to stay out until midnight, you would say, no problem. Just make sure you don't get in an accident when you bring the car back home. Your daughter says, I want to stay until 9 o'clock, and you are probably bent out of shape. Like, my God, Qiyamah has come that she has asked you to stay out tonight. I'm just making this as a small talk point. This is not the main point of the talk. The main point is that why do we apply differential standards? The Prophet ﷺ did not treat people like that. And when you think about the issues of our community, don't think about it that we need to empower women because we are doing some favor to them. You're not doing any favor. You're doing a favor to yourself. If 50% of the community, conservatively 50% of the community is women, right? At least 50% of the community is women. Actually, women outnumber men in most communities. So if 50% of your community, their brain power is left on the side, how do you think the community will be empowered? We are missing out. And how people are raised, their gender, their life choices, the way they act, they each have a perspective to offer. When I looked at the Prime Minister of New Zealand, I posted this on my Facebook. I said, it is not a coincidence that she's a woman. At this moment in time, this is not the first time a country has faced a tragedy like this. In our country, we faced it several times. Our president did not act this way. There were men. She did. She's a woman. She brought something different to the table that no man could have brought. And that made that country stronger. It made their society better. These are the questions I think we should reflect upon. As my dear brother Saud says, that sometimes I say things that get people all riled up, but that's not my intent. My intent is, I don't have answers to all questions. I don't profess to have answers to all the questions. But my perspective only is, let's ask the questions. If we are not asking the right questions, how on earth will we ever get to the right answer? We are even afraid to ask the question. Ask the question. Push people to consider. Ask them why not. And you will find that the scripture actually supports most of this position. The scripture is much more open. The Quran is much more open, much more egalitarian than the way we understand the Quran. We understand the message of Islam to be. A just God is not going to say 50% of the world, you stay in the background while the rest of the world moves forward. Just not possible. So we have to examine our own scriptures. There's nothing wrong with the scripture. The scriptures are fine. It's our understanding that is faulty. We have to engage with the scripture in a much more dynamic manner. Ask the hard questions. The Quran, the message of the Quran is for all times and all places. The world has changed. Our understanding of humanity has changed. Nothing wrong. I'm not faulting scholars who lived in the 10th century or 11th century or 12th century because of their opinions. They did the best they could. They were the product of their time. But given how much human knowledge has shifted, not just in science and technology, I'm in social sciences. Just look at our understanding of the human psyche, how much it has changed. What we understood human nature to be, what we understood human behavioral impulses to be, is dramatically different even in the last 50 years. The progression of knowledge has, like, in an order of magnitude change in the last 50 to 100 years. So given that, does it not make sense that we re-engage with our scripture in a much more dynamic way and ask the questions? We may not get all the answers we want, but at least we should ask the question.
Actually, I'll disagree with you on one thing.
Sure.
If you look at the scripture, you will get the answer. And what's interesting is that, about Sheikh Akram, and I'll end off on these 2 points. Number one, the biggest problem and controversy Sheikh Akram has had with this 50-volume set? He can't find someone to publish it.
I know.
That's actually the biggest problem that he's having. Number two, you mentioned 10th century, 11th century, 12th century. Actually, no. It's more like 17th century, 18th century, 19th century.
Right.
The scholars, actually, it's really interesting. When you go back to the books of fiqh and books of hadith, when you actually examine the way men and women interacted, it was actually a very normal way of interacting. Up until colonists kind of set their foot in lands that were not their own, for some reason, Muslims adopted very stringent and strict opinions which came to be over 1,000 years ago, and I'll tell you why. When there was a project conducted by the Abbasid dynasty, which many of you may be familiar with, the Baytul Hikmah project, right? This was the House of Wisdom. Anybody has heard this before, where Greek texts were being translated into Arabic, and they were being translated from Greek, and they were being translated from Aramaic, wherein discussions about how medicine is going to be conducted, how history is going to be studied, all these different aspects and ideas, of which one of them was transferred about the remedial nature of women. Actually, that was something that sourced itself from a Western Greek thought in the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th century. And it's just interesting how, for some reason, Muslims ended up going that route when our own tradition teaches us that men and women were equally, if not more involved, in society, if not more so than other faiths would allow, more so than how other societies would show. But it's literally, we are our own enemies sometimes when we forget that.
Yeah, we do. I mean,
Yeah.
the first person to believe in the message of the Prophet ﷺ was a woman.
Yeah.
The first person to be martyred was a woman. The oldest existing university in the world, University of Qarawiyyin in Fez, Morocco, was built by a woman, Fatima al-Tarri. So there has been, dramatic contributions of women in Muslim society. Ibn Taymiyyah, who we think of as a very conservative, very Puritan kind of a Islamic scholar. Some would even consider hardline Islamic scholar. One of his teachers was a woman. And she used to teach him in the mosque. In one of my papers, I wrote about this as I was researching this area. It's a very fascinating conversation he had, a fascinating transformation he had about this issue. At one point, he was bothered by it because his ideas were a little bit, very conservative in the way he interpreted text, which is, legitimate. In every religion, you have people who interpret text very conservatively. Some people will interpret it very progressively, and that's fine. That kind of diversity is welcome within any religious tradition. To the point that he was bothered by it, and then he said that I saw Prophet ﷺ in a dream, where the Prophet ﷺ with your study with this woman Sheikha. So those were the tradition, and today I was telling this story to a group of friends over dinner today. My daughter is a hafidha of the Quran. She finished memorizing Quran before she entered college. By the time she finished high school, before graduating high school, she had finished it, and then she went on to college. The day she finished her memorization of the Quran, she was of course very excited, and we were very happy, and we wanted the community to also know about her achievement. We came to the masjid. The Imam acknowledged her and said that today we have this sister who finished memorizing the Quran, and she was asked to read something from the Quran, recite something from the Quran, but she was asked to read from the back of the room. Until this day, she's now in graduate school. One of the happiest days of her life, she felt was scarred. Why was she not asked to come in front of the community and recite the Quran to the entire community? She was only one of 3 people in my community that I know in the last 10 years who have memorized the Quran, become hafiz. 2 of them are women, one boy. Why do we treat women in this manner? There is nothing wrong. If she could have come in front and recited the Quran, what would have happened? But the Saud was Islam khatre mein nahi aaya na. Nothing would have happened to Islam. It would be the right thing to do. We can't treat people like this. It does not serve our interests at all. And if you talk to women, I can guarantee you, if you talk to women, they will tell you stories. I used to go to a mosque I was in Harrisburg. I was teaching at Penn State. The entrance to the woman was in the basement of the mosque. So the women had to climb down the stairs, go into a dark room, while the men prayed on the top. You ask, I don't need to read the Quran, I don't need to know any hadith to know that's wrong. Period. End of story. But we don't think. You know, I took my children to India. I'm from India. I took my children to India, and Jummah time came, and over here, the women come to the masjid for Jummah. In India, my daughter said, "Can I go to Jummah?" I said, "No, you can't." In my neighborhood, there's not a single masjid where women could go for Jummah. There's a problem. We have to start talking. The fact that we live such a privileged life in this country, the fact that I am in your masjid and openly discussing these issues is a point of privilege. Let's use this privilege to lift up the voices, the status of people who are part of us, who deserve much better than we have been able to provide for them. If I've offended you or anything, if I said something that is wrong, may you forgive me, and may Allah forgive me for anything that I said is wrong. And if I said something that is pleasing to you and you feel that it has provoked some thought in you, please make dua for me and my family.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Pervez. Inshallah, again, if you were offended, then Brother Anis is here. You can take it out on him. But we are going to go ahead and do the adhan for prayer. Dr. Pervez is here. And inshallah, if you have any questions, you can ask him, inshallah. Jazakallah. Yes.
One of the reasons I'm here is, Brother Saud, if you can please distribute it. On Sunday, I'm having